Hi, I'm Susan Brownrigg, the author of Gracie Fairshaw and the Mysterious Guest, which is published today. I'm really excited. Thanks for joining me on launch day. I thought I might read you the very first chapter. Chapter 1, The Majestic. Most folk only noticed one thing about Gracie Fairshaw, but she noticed everything about them. "Come in," said Mrs. Yates, the landlady, ushering the Fairshaws into the majestic boarding house. Mrs. Yates was dressed in a cheery lilac ensemble, but Gracie spotted dark shadows under her eyes and noticed that her skirt was a good size too big. Mrs. Yates was not sleeping and had lost weight. The widow was still grieving. "Sorry we're a bit late. George needed a wee," said Ma, ruffling his blonde hair. "I had hoped he'd learned to control his bladder by now. He is 9 after all." "Ma!" wailed George. "Don't worry about it," said Mrs. Yates. "Let's go into the parlour to do the handover. You'll be wanting to get yourself settled in as soon as possible after your journey." Gracie was glad to put her suitcase down. It weighed a ton. She left it next to Ma's and George's in the hall, and they all followed Mrs. Yates. The parlour was furnished, but without any knickknacks to make the room feel homely. There were a couple of faded armchairs with lace antimacassars covering the worn patches, a battered round table, an empty display cabinet, and an old piano. Gracie tried to picture their family photographs on the wall and Ma's shepherdess ornament on the mantelpiece. It wasn't easy. The Majestic didn't feel like it belonged to them yet. George threw himself into one of the armchairs. Her younger brother seemed to have no such concerns. "Don't get too comfy, lad," said Mrs. Yates. "It's hard work running a boarding house, and your ma is going to need you both to help." She smiled at Gracie, but her eyes were on her left arm, which ended just past her elbow. "Don't look so worried, dear. Phyllis, my best maid, has agreed to stay on for the weekend. She'll show you the ropes." Gracie blushed. She wandered over to the bay window and peered out through a gap in the curtains at the dark street. Every house in the row seemed to be a boarding house too. "You've explained to your guests that there may be a little disruption?" asked Ma. Gracie turned to see Mrs. Yates place a hand on Ma's shoulder. "Yes, I'm sorry I couldn't hold off the handover until after the illuminations. These last few guests will be no bother. It'll be like having an extended family for a few days." Gracie's stomach swirled at the thought of sharing her home with strangers. Strangers stirred and made clumsy comments about her arm. "I've told my regulars they can stay on till Sunday," said Mrs. Yates. "They come every year for the lights, and these new switch-on events are becoming very popular. It's only the second time there's been a guest of honour to press the button. We're lucky here in Blackpool that our season is so long. Next year you'll have guests staying right through October. I've left you a few basics in the kitchen till you get settled in. There's Eccles cakes, tea and a bottle of milk." Mrs. Yates pulled out a bunch of keys from her lilac cardigan pocket. "Congratulations, Mrs. Fairshaw. You are officially the Majestic's new landlady. I hope you will be as happy here as my husband and I were." "Oh, we will be," said Ma. "I just know it." Gracie leaned against the wall as Ma unlocked the door to their private quarters. She closed her eyes, picturing their old home. On the outside, their house looked like hundreds of others in Milltown, a little brick terrace shrouded in thick smog. There was no greyness inside, though, only colour and warmth, thanks to Ma's beautiful handmade cushions, curtains, quilts, throws and rag rugs. Gracie blinked away a tear at the thought of the new owners settling in and using them. Ma's words echoed in her mind. "We'll travel light. The Majestic has everything we need." But it didn't have any of the things that mattered to Gracie. She'd missed the little park at the end of the street, the friends who understood that she sometimes struggled with new situations, and the neighbour's cat that would rub its body against her legs every morning. She shook off her memories at the sound of George dragging his suitcase down the short hallway. She picked up her own and followed him. "I still can't believe you've poked holes into it," said Gracie, grinning. "I had to," replied George, undoing the catches. "How else is Fred supposed to breathe?" "In Milltown," said Ma as they entered the small kitchen. "That was what we decided, wasn't it?" "Fred's changed his mind. He wants to live in Blackpool too." He lifted out his pet rat and stroked its dark fur. "He fancies a bit of sea air." Ma laughed as she filled the kettle. "I must be soft. Go on, take him into your room, George. We don't want the guests seeing him." "Fred can sleep in my case tonight," said George, wrinkling his brow, "but we'll have to get him a proper cage soon." They gathered around the kitchen table and waited for the kettle to boil. Ma put a teapot on the table and laid out 3 cups and saucers. She found the paper bag of Eccles cakes in the bread bin and put one of them for each of them onto a plate. George bit straight into his. "I can't believe the Majestic is actually mine," said Ma, pouring the tea. "It's just as I remember. I had such lovely family holidays in Blackpool, and there's so much more to do nowadays. The beach is really close, you can paddle in the sea, ride on a donkey and build a sandcastle too. There's yummy seaside food, ice cream, candy floss and pink sticks of rock. Then there's the pier, the open-air baths and the Pleasure Beach fairground, all on our doorstep. And the tower, of course. I loved it here when I was a kid, and I'm sure you will too." Gracie's chest tightened. She lifted her teacup to hide her trembling bottom lip. How could she spoil Ma's delight by telling her she was worried she was going to hate living in Blackpool? "Ma's put some clothes in your room," said George, pushing past Gracie as she came out of the bathroom the following morning. "You're going to look so funny." Gracie sighed and went back to her bedroom. There was a maid's outfit on her bed. She picked up the black dress first. The colour had faded and the short sleeves were a bit frayed. The white apron was yellowed and the pocket was torn on one edge. A hand-me-down, probably from Phyllis. Gracie put the clothes on and looked in the mirror. The dress was too big and just seemed to hang from her. She gave her wavy, bobbed hair a fresh brush, then pulled on her plimsolls. Gracie picked up the apron and went to the kitchen to ask Ma to help with the straps. She would have to practice so she could tie them easily herself. "You look nice, very smart," said Ma as Gracie entered the kitchen. She held her hand out to receive the apron. "It's a bit loose," said Gracie. "You don't want it too tight to work in," said Ma. She wrapped the apron around her waist and pulled the straps tight. "There, perfect. The apron makes a real difference. Oh, but that pocket could do with fixing, couldn't it? I'll sew it tonight." Gracie rubbed at the dress's collar as she watched Ma drop a slice of lard into the frying pan on the electric stove. The counter was full of food. Ma had ordered enough bacon to feed an army, along with trays of eggs, strings of sausages, black pudding and catering-sized tins of baked beans, and not a scrap for the Fairshaws until breakfast service was finished. "Why don't you collect the bowls?" said Ma as she lowered some rashers into the hot fat. "The guests should have finished their cornflakes by now." Gracie wiped her brow and took an empty tray to collect in the dirty plates. The smell of bacon and eggs would usually be a comforting one, but this morning it made her feel queasy. She swung open the dining room door with her hip. The Majestic felt like an overstuffed suitcase about to burst its locks. Gracie made her way across the room, swerving round the guest chairs. Everywhere she looked, families were shoveling food into their mouths as though it was a race to finish breakfast first. Gracie went over to introduce herself to the maid. Phyllis looked about 3 years older than Gracie, around 17. She had long, dark brown hair and curves that looked unhappily restrained in her black dress. Her apron was starched white and perfectly pressed. "Have you waitressed before?" asked Phyllis, her brown eyes appraising Gracie's appearance. Gracie shook her head. "Good job Mrs. Yates kept me on then," said Phyllis, beaming. "What about bed making?" "I find a way to do most new things," said Gracie, raising her chin. The maid nodded, then suddenly swept up a cruet set from the sideboard and passed it to a woman around Ma's age with surprisingly grey hair. The woman took a pencil from behind her ear and jotted down something in the notebook she had secreted on her lap. Gracie desperately wanted to know what she had written. She was convinced the guest was making notes about the Majestic. It made her uneasy. The door into the kitchen opened and George sauntered in with half a sausage in his mouth. Gracie giggled and beckoned him over. "Does Ma know you've got that?" George chewed down the last of the sausage. "It was a bit burnt. Still tastes good, though." "But don't be pinching any leftovers off people's plates," said Gracie. "We're supposed to wait for our breakfast, remember?" "I'm really looking forward to the illuminations, aren't you?" asked Phyllis when Gracie returned. "I think we'll be too busy to see the lights," replied Gracie. "Oh, but you must. I've been telling all the guests about them. They're using over 300,000 bulbs or lamps this year. Lots of coloured ones too, according to the Gazette." "Oh," said Gracie, "that does sound a lot." "My favourites are the animated tableau. Of course, you have to go all the way up to North Shore Cliffs to see them." Gracie looked blankly at her. "They're big pictures made up of lights that move," she explained. "But if you want to stay nearer to home, the pleasure beach is to be lit up in neon. We could go together if you fancy it." "No, thanks. Won't it be very crowded?" Gracie shuddered as she imagined faceless crowds, thousands of strangers pouring out onto the Golden Mile, smothering the promenade, the beaches and Blackpool's 3 piers. "Well, you're not going to like living in Blackpool if you don't like crowds," scoffed Phyllis. "Blimey O'Reilly!" exclaimed George. Gracie turned to see a glamorous couple enter the room. She was glad for the distraction and led them to a table. They were only just in time for breakfast. The dark-haired man wore an expression as sombre as his suit. The blonde woman wore dark sunglasses and gritted teeth. Gracie felt the man's eyes bore into her. Had she been staring at them for too long? They seemed far too posh to be staying in the Majestic. "You're new," he said. "My mother has taken over the Majestic," replied Gracie. "Your mother?" Understanding dawned on his face, and his eyes widened. "Ah, yes, Mrs. Yates mentioned something about new owners." He smiled. "Well, let's hope her breakfasts are as good." "Yes, sir. Would either of you like a drink first?" "Nothing for me," mumbled the woman. "My wife will have a black coffee, and a tea for me, please." "We'd like more tea too," called out one of the elderly twin sisters on the adjacent table. "If you can manage with your arm," said the other, peering over her glasses. Gracie felt her cheeks burn up. She backed away from the table. She could feel everyone's eyes on her. Their expressions were the usual mixture of discomfort, pity and sympathy. Gracie went to the side to pour their drinks. Her hand was shaking as she lifted the coffee pot. "Mr. Dixon has that effect on me too," said Phyllis. "I think he looks just like that Hollywood actor. Oh, you know who I mean. Clark Gable." "He's got a moustache," said George, rolling his eyes, "that's all." "Make yourself useful and tell Ma there's 2 more for breakfast," said Gracie. "I'll take those drinks," said Phyllis. Most of the other guests had already left. There was just one more family in the dining room. The husband and wife were taking it in turns to persuade their little girl to eat her cereal. It was taking a long time. "I suppose your Ma will be making lots of changes now she's taken over the Majestic," said Phyllis. "What? Oh, yes," said Gracie. "I suppose we might." "You should chuck out that piano. It's so old-fashioned. Happen you could get a Decca gramophone or a wireless." It'd be nice for guests to be able to listen to latest dance bands," agreed Gracie. "Also, don't get me started on that wallpaper," Phyllis sighed, looking at the beige floral print. "I mean, really, it's practically Victorian. I think a nice, fashionable geometric pattern would be better." "I'm not sure if we can afford—" "Well, it won't cost out to get rid of that." Phyllis pointed at a house rules sign hanging on the wall. "Guests must refrain from noise when rising. Children must refrain from playing on the stairs and landing. Children must refrain from playing the communal piano." There was a sudden crashing sound. Gracie span around to see Ma standing in the doorway. 2 upturned plates of breakfast lay on the floor. "You'll have to add a new carpet to your list," said Phyllis. Ma was staring into the dining room. Her face was as pale as egg white.